This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for March 21st, 2017, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, McCuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everyone.
We have a great show for you today. Christina is going to look into whether it's illegal to take photos of the night-lit Eiffel Tower.
Ah,
And then Adam is going to look into whether there were Irish slaves.
that's right.
But first, have you ever heard of implicit bias? Perhaps you've heard of the idea that you're not consciously biased, but you're unconsciously biased. Racial discrimination is one of the big examples that's often used.
Oh, yeah.
In psychological research, the Implicit Association Test is a very popular tool that assesses one's implicit bias. But does it actually do that?
Oh, I
Oh,
think I
no.
did one of these on the internet. once.
Let's find out. I'll tell you what it is, and then we'll explore its validity. This has been on my mind for a while, but Jesse Singal wrote a really long piece in New York Mag that re-inspired me. What is it? The Implicit Association Test, or IAT, as I'm going to refer to it, was introduced into the scientific literature in 1998 by Anthony Greenwald, Debbie McGee, and Jordan Schwartz. And this is straight from the IAT's website, Project Implicit, at Harvard. The IAT measures the strength of associations between concepts, such as black people or gay people, and evaluations, such as good or bad, or stereotypes, such as athletic or clumsy. The main idea is that making a response is easier when closely related items share the same response key. We would say that one has an implicit preference for straight people relative to gay people if they are faster to categorize words when gay people and bad share a response relative to when gay people and good share a response key. Might sound a little complicated. You're just trying to put words associate with one or another by pressing buttons on a computer. How the test generally works. In the first part of the IAT, you sort words relating to concepts. For example, fat people and thin people into categories. If the category fat people was on the left and a picture of a heavy person appeared on the screen, you would press the E key instead of the I key. Okay? It's just a way of categorizing what you see. Image pops up, you put it in a certain category.
With E being the key on the left and I being the key on your right.
Thank you, Adam. Exactly. In the second part of the IAT, you sort words relating to evaluation, such as good and bad. If the category good was on the left and a pleasant word appeared on the screen, you would press the E key, again, sending it to the left. In the third part of the IAT, the categories are combined, and you are asked to sort both concept and evaluation words. So the categories on the left-hand side would be fat people / good, and the categories on the right-hand side would be thin people / bad, for example. And then they balance these in different orders. There's typically 5 sessions that they go through to try to make sure that everything's balanced in the right way. That's generally how it works. There's different variations, but that's generally how it works. And there are many different types of IAT, but I'm going to focus on the race IAT because that seems to be the most popular, it seems to have the most impact in popular literature, and is probably the most researched. The things that you will categorize link to racial concepts as opposed to something else. You could have age, you could have something else, you could have gender. There's a whole range of different IAT things that can be done, but I'm going to focus on the race one. It's important to note that not every criticism of the race IAT applies to the other IATs. All right?
Oh, okay.
They're not all the same thing. Although it is a similar type of test, they're not quite the same. So first, popularity. I said this was popular, but how so? Well, good old Malcolm Gladwell, you might have heard of. He's promoted it in one of his books. The New York Times has mentioned it. Many aspects of the test are used in various educational settings. Further, Singal indicates that by the end of 2015, more than 17 million individual test sessions were completed on the website.
Sheesh.
Wow.
This is because you can go to the website and take it for free. If you try to think of the sample size that we talk about, they had a sample size of this many people, 100 people, 1,000 people, some sort of large cardiac test, they have tens of thousands. You're like, 17 million. That's not bad.
I did this test on the website like before the podcast. So,
Right.
You know, that's
Me too.
Sort of a random data point there, but yes.
Right. I can't fully summarize all the different interpretations of this test, but it has long been thought to be a test of an individual's unconscious prejudice. Sometimes proponents are careful to say it isn't quite that, but more often one is left with the impression that is exactly what it does. Mm-hmm. You take the test, you find out you have a differential reaction time to perhaps black being associated to good versus white being associated to good, and then you're like, oh, it turns out you're a little implicitly racist.
Yeah.
Singal quotes Banerjee and Greenwald's 2013 book, Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. This is a quote. The automatic white preference expressed on the race IAT is now established as signaling discriminatory behavior. It predicts discriminatory behavior even among research participants who earnestly, and we believe honestly, espouse egalitarian beliefs. That last statement may sound like a self-contradiction, but it's an empirical truth. Among research participants who describe themselves as racially egalitarian, the race IAT has shown, reliably and repeatedly, to predict discriminatory behavior that was observed in the research. That sounds pretty strong as a predictor of individual implicit associations and biases.
Oh, yeah.
So this is a popular test, but is it a good test in its own right? And relatedly, does the IAT accurately measure implicit bias in the first place, and how large a role does implicit bias play in discriminatory activities? Mm-hmm. By its own right, I mean to say, is the test reliable? One of the ways in which we're curious if something is good is if a test is reliable. Mm-hmm. If you take the test, wait some time, then take it again, do you get the same answers? As long as what you're measuring won't change rapidly, you should get the same answers from a good test. This is called retest reliability, and a perfect score would equal 1. If you happen to take a test that ranks 10 people, if you took it 2 days later, same test, same 10 people, in theory would rank them the same way. Mm-hmm. Perfect score is 1. Better and kind of what you want is 0.8, maybe 0.7, as in terms of desirability for a psychological test. And, of course, within at least 30 minutes, you hope it would be tie. If you took a test and 30 minutes later you took the same test, it's supposed to measure the same thing similarly. The race IAT actually hasn't received dedicated analysis on this particular issue of reliability, which is surprising given how popular it is, but what has been reported isn't great. And just for some context, when I talked about the measure 1.8, 0.7, that's usually referenced as R, so R equals 0.8 is kind of what you want. And then this is a quote from Singal. R equals 0.32 was found in a study consisting of 4 race IAT sessions conducted with 2 weeks between each of them. R equals 0.65 in a study in which 2 tests were conducted 24 hours apart, and R equals 0.39 in a study in which the 2 tests were conducted during the same test session, but in which one used names and the other used pictures, so it's not exactly quite the same. In 2014, using a large sample, Yoav Bar Anan and Nosik, 2 different researchers, reported a race IAT retest reliability of 0.4, and Calvin Lai, a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard who is the director of research at Project Implicit, ran the numbers from some of his own data and came up with similar results. Ouch! That's not good at all. Now, some might say, well, there's only several examples, and there's many others that show that's a higher number. Yes, that's true. This thing does have a wide range, and that's part of the problem. Okay, but does this actually predict racial discrimination? It may not do it reliably, but maybe it's actually going to do it in some way.
Yeah.
This isn't that easy to do in a lab setting, because you're trying to think, how is someone implicitly biased? And then you have to set up a situation in a laboratory setting, which then they're going to demonstrate overt discriminatory behavior.
So as you leave the place where you did this test on a little computer, a white guy and a black guy ask you for a loan or something like that.
That actually could be one of them. Yes, that is one way they can possibly do it. Now, it's not that easy to do, despite Adam's well-done suggestion. But there are different ways to manipulate the variables. And one you could think of is hiring scenarios with different names to code for race. This is where they show 2 resumes. They're exactly the same, 2 different groups of people. One is a white-sounding name, the other is a black-sounding name, that sort of thing. We like studies on the show, but we like meta-analyses even better. But this issue has been contentious enough that there are dueling meta-analyses for interpretations of the data that has actually been occurred and studied on this. From Singal, proponents argue that the race IAT scores accounted for about 5.5% of the variation in discriminatory behavior in lab settings. It's really low, by the way.
Yeah.
Because when you're comparing these things, it's not like you can say it accounts for 5% of the difference in scores. That's not quite what it means, but it has to do with percent of the variation that's explained. Mm-hmm. Other groups have said it's too messy to even do this analysis, while others still put the numbers at 1 or 2%. Yes, these are very low numbers no matter what. Regardless of these low numbers, the proponents of the test, in a response to critics, wrote that these issues make the IAT, quote, problematic to use to classify persons as likely to engage in discrimination. In that same paper, they noted that, quote, attempts to diagnostically use such measures for individuals risk undesirably high rates of erroneous classifications. So these are the proponents of the test basically saying this shouldn't be used for individuals. This means it shouldn't be used to measure an individual's likelihood to engage in discrimination.
But does anybody? Like, is anyone making them do this test before they get a job or something like that?
No, but they sometimes do it in like business education training seminars to have people learn about these things.
Sure.
Or even students. Look how biased you are.
When you do a Myers-Briggs test to tell you about yourself or something
like
that. Right?
So people take it, and they are surprised to find out they have implicit biases. Mm-hmm. It turns out what they really have is differential reaction time. because that's what they're using as a proxy. And that sounds a lot less surprising or interesting. And this goes to something called construct validity. Does the test measure what it's supposed to actually measure?
Yeah.
And this too has been debated, and that the test might be picking up familiarity one has with a group or even empathy with their oppression. Studies have been done to support this in different ways. So you are fully aware of how people are oppressed, and you know, say, in a certain society, black people tend to be thought of worse than white people, and you might be thinking about that, which then leads to a differential reaction time.
So I have an easier time categorizing within the stereotype that I'm aware of but don't agree with, for example.
Exactly.
Like that. Oh.
And for the most part, if you go to take this test on the website, it says it's going to reveal something about you.
Yeah.
And even the author's like, oh, it was deeply moving when I learned this about me. Like, you just said you shouldn't use it for individuals. So what was deeply moving?
Yeah.
Further, the algorithm that spits out your answer has some quirks. Specifically, if you are consistent, you get a more extreme score, even if you're not consistently extreme. A critic, Blanton, told Singal, quote, if a race IAT test taker is exactly 1 millisecond faster on each and every white/good trial as compared to a black/bad trial, they will get the most extreme label. Wow. That is, the test will tell them that they are extremely implicitly biased, despite their having exhibited almost zero bias in their actual performance. This is an extreme example, of course, but Blanton says he's confident this algorithmic quirk is affecting real-world results. Last part is a quote. This is all very concerning, as people believe the IAT predicts discriminatory behavior even in people with sincerely progressive beliefs, as it was said in that quote at the beginning of their 2013 book. Now, that said, you might think, okay, this isn't necessarily good for individuals, but it can still be used for two main reasons: as a means of estimating the level of implicit bias in society, and also as an educational tool. Both these raise serious questions too, though. There's something appealing about a measure being useful in aggregate, even if you can't use it individually. Perhaps that's what a BMI is useful for. We've talked about that. Don't look at it yourself for a BMI, but as a population metric, as a single number, it gives some indication of maybe how a society should function. But if you are unclear what something means at an individual level, it isn't clear at all what it means at a group level. Yeah. The group has an implicit bias, even though that particular group would rarely make a decision. It kind of seems incoherent. So if you're saying, well, you can't look at individuals, but these 17 million people together are implicitly biased.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so what do we do about that then? You target the 17 million as a group?
Well, you just say society has an implicit bias, and
sure, of a huge range of who knows what, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the issue in broad sense with the group. As for educational tools, it does tell people that they don't fully know themselves and that they have unconscious biases. That really doesn't seem bad, and that's what we discuss and promote on this show.
Sure.
But we also want data to back up that claim. And it doesn't do people any good to have a false belief about their hidden biases and what they mean. So those are the problems. That said, racism does exist, and it is often systemic. People are often unconsciously biased, and they are also unaware of it. As a good quote from Rob Willer, he's saying that unconscious racial prejudice exists and it has consequences, but he believes that racial inequality in America is probably driven more by structural factors like concentrated poverty, the racial wealth gap, differential exposure to violence, and availability of early childhood education, and so on. Past racial prejudices obviously led to the creation of these systems and structures. Yeah. All that to say, I think there is racism and prejudice, but the IAT is not nearly at all as good or reliable or has construct validity in the way that I thought. This was actually pretty shocking to me, by the way. If I'm my background in psychology, this was a big deal. I took the test. I thought it was legitimate. And now it seems, at least for the race, there are many, many debatable problems that may actually be terminal in terms of an individual using it to justify any understanding of their own implicit biases.
That's interesting.
Worse then, I didn't have time to go into it, but there's like, should we even target implicit bias as a problem in society?
Yeah.
And then it's like, you know what? A, we don't know if it's that big a factor in any of this stuff, and B, we wouldn't even sure how to do it. It's probably best to focus on those other things that I mentioned that try to get rid of discriminatory hiring practices and inequality. I know I am biased towards the lovely baguettes that they have in Paris as opposed to lousy anywhere else on Earth. And when I was there, I took some wonderful photos of the Eiffel Tower at night, so I can only assume I'm going to be arrested now. Cristina, is that true?
So people close to me know that I have a soft spot for Paris. I went about 13 years ago with a good friend, and we had a blast traveling together. And recently, she unfortunately lost a family member, so she's in full-on carpe diem mode right now. So she texted me saying she was going to Paris for her birthday later this year and asked if by chance could I go with her. So needless to say, I've been Googling Paris a lot more than usual lately, and last week came across the following claim in more than one spot. It is illegal to take photographs of the Eiffel Tower at night without explicit permission. Darren and Adam, what do you think about that claim?
It seems so ridiculously unenforceable that even if it were one of these true on the books somewhere thing, there's no way anyone would follow it. That is my sort of...
Such an Adam answer.
Yeah, and my take is somewhat similar that I don't think it's true, and if it is true, it could be one of these like antiquated things that existed after cameras existed, but a while ago that it's on the books and no one's enforcing it in any way because Paris is too popular for tourists.
Yeah.
Right. Pat and I both thought off mic that this sounded pretty BS-y too.
Mm-hmm.
It just strikes me as like you can't take a picture of the CN Tower or you can't take a picture of the London Bridge. Like it just sounds ridiculous.
But at night too, right? So if you're like at dusk or twilight, it might be okay.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the clincher. So I came across this curiosity on Snopes. They published a fact check on the claim last week. So if going to Paris has been on your bucket list, you will likely take about 100 or more photos of the Eiffel Tower, its most iconic landmark, from a variety of angles during the day and at night. It stands to reason that many of you will post these photos on your Facebook or other socials. Could you really be at risk of getting fined or sued for posting photographs of the Eiffel Tower? As Snopes puts it, quote, "It technically is true." And distributing photographs of the night-lit Eiffel Tower is a violation of the artist's copyright. That may have either clarified something for you or confused you more. The Eiffel Tower was constructed in 1889 and is considered to be in the public domain, as you mentioned earlier, Pat. But in 1985, they added a light show, which is considered to be an artistic display, and therefore it's copyright protected. So that is all true. Snopes gives a pretty succinct explanation. Quote, "Because the lighting is attached to the Eiffel Tower, and since any photographs of the Eiffel Tower taken at night aren't likely to be terribly interesting without the lights, the practical effect is that nighttime images of the Eiffel Tower are a violation of the artist's copyright under French law."
I wonder if that's the same with the CN Tower because there's a light show at the CN Tower at night.
I did not come across that in any of my research, but then again, maybe because it's a Canadian landmark, I don't know. But that's a good point. We should look that up. So, yeah, the lighting is considered to be artistic work separate from the tower.
Like artistically commissioned by the state?
It's a copywritten artistic display.
Interesting.
Or for that matter, the Parliament buildings has like a light show in the summer, doesn't it?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
it does.
So this makes things a little confusing, according to an article in Metro UK, especially since, and here this will make a little more sense to you guys, most countries abide by something called freedom of panorama. According to the European Union's Article 5 of its 2001 Copyright Directive, people can take photos of architectural works situated in public places and publish or distribute them in most European countries without first asking for permission. But guess what? The directive is not mandatory for every country in the EU, and so France said no.
Wow.
So if you want to publish an image of a night-lit Eiffel Tower to social media, you technically are supposed to get permission from the Eiffel Tower's operating company, which is called La Société d'Exploitation de la Tour Eiffel.
So you'll have to send them that note in French.
As well, yeah.
Yes, I would hope.
The reason you need their permission is because under European copyright law, not only are you not allowed to sell the photos or publish them commercially, you are not allowed to post them on social media. There's actually an international copyright treaty, the Berne Convention, which provides protection for literary and artistic works. Even Snopes states at the bottom of their article, which is pretty funny, that since they are a commercial website, they use a daytime photo of the Eiffel Tower in the article to represent the night-lit Eiffel Tower.
They could have, photoshopped a bunch of lights.
A really great piece in Art Law Journal, however, says there is a difference between owning and enforcing a copyright. There you go, Adam. Yeah. Writer Steve Schlockman nicely breaks down the implications of trying to enforce this. How do you check that everyone taking a photo at night has permission? If you Google Eiffel Tower at night, you'll get over 22 million results. How could you possibly track down every photographer of a night-lit Eiffel Tower and issue cease and desist letters to all of those people, let alone follow up and actually sue those that don't comply?
Get Disney on the case. We'll do it.
Right.
Yeah, provide a financial incentive, I think.
Sony, Disney, Viacom.
Plus, it would come across as pretty petty and a waste of resources. So it's not really great PR, especially since the majority of these photos are simply innocent vacation photos. Yeah. Schlockman concluded that you shouldn't worry too much if you're posting a tourist shot to Facebook. In fact, in a recent scan of the Société website, the only indication that publishing photos of an illuminated Eiffel Tower requires permission is tucked away in the FAQ section. The real concern is people using the photographs for financial gain or commercial use without paying a licensing fee. So members of the European Parliament are fighting to lift these restrictions right now, and online freedom advocates are really critical of the lack of freedom of panorama across the EU. Oh yeah, which reminds me, France is not the only country who banned photos under the copyright law. An article in Politico, which I highly recommend reading if you want to get into the super nitty-gritty of the law and all the politics playing out. They cite that Italy and Denmark do too, and the EU Observer mentions Strasbourg and Belgium's European parliaments. So, in a nutshell, the claim that it's illegal to take photographs of the Eiffel Tower at night without explicit permission is true. But the reality check is this would be near impossible to enforce, and unless you're profiting by uploading or publishing the photo, you really don't have much to worry about.
So stay tuned this summer for pictures of the Eiffel Tower at night from Cristina.
A million pictures of the Eiffel Tower at night.
Defiant pictures.
Yeah.
Interesting. This weekend I saw the new Beauty and the Beast film, and they go to Paris at one point, and there's just a shot of Paris, the landscape at night. There's no Eiffel Tower in it, and it was just jarring. I'm like, what's going on with this picture? And it would have taken place before the Eiffel Tower was built.
Adam, were Irish people ever slaves?
Last week was St. Patrick's Day, a day celebrated by a special group of people. People who like to drink beer. But did you know that St. Patrick's Day is actually an Irish holiday? Ask any 1/8 Irish person and they'll tell you all about it.
Especially after a couple of Guinness.
As occurs many years around this time, there are a number of articles shared around social media talking about Irish slaves. I caught wind of some of the controversy around these as I heard some less than open-minded people complaining about fake news sites like the New York Times and Snopes getting it all wrong. What?
Who do you hang out with, Adam?
It was I actually saw it on my Sailor Moon Twitter feed. It's not really related, but you know. The claim, which is often copy and pasted from the same articles, states that before there were African slaves in the New World, there were Irish slaves. It includes a lot of disputed numbers and detail about their terrible lives. Such articles are often accompanied by some kind of commentary about how our society and schools teach us all about African slaves, but not about these forgotten white slaves. When I caught wind of this, I just had to see what kind of closed-minded conclusions Snopes made and found their page, were there Irish slaves in America too? And they determined mixture. What a controversy. Mm. Then they went on to explain things. Fake news. So what's going on here? Were there Irish slaves? Sort of. Was that situation anything like African slavery? Not really. African slaves are what's referred to as chattel slavery, sometimes referred to as traditional slavery. In this case, slaves were treated as personal property. They were bought and sold as a commodity, and if they had children, those children were also slaves. These were slaves for life. This form of slavery is nearly non-existent today. Darren talked about slavery on an earlier episode of the podcast, and in that we learned that there are a lot of other forms of slavery. One form of slavery that is common today is debt slavery. Basically, a person owes some debt and is forced to work it off. They are slaves while working off that debt, and in some cases, this can last for a considerable amount of time. Irish slaves were largely what is referred to as indentured servants. Traveling to the New World in the 17th and 18th century was very expensive, and the early rich settlers needed laborers. Those who could not afford to pay their way to the Americas were brought in under contracts to do work for a certain period, usually from 2 to 7 years, until they earned their freedom. Were they slaves? Well, once they made that agreement, they were not free to leave. They were not slaves for life. Their children were not born into slavery. They were not chattel slaves, but they could technically be referred to as slaves. And you could technically say that esports are sports.
So, Adam, just to be clear, they agree to doing this, kind of like enlisting in the army.
Correct. For the most part, they did agree. However, there were a small number of people who were forcibly removed from their homes and forced into indentured servitude. So that's sort of a different level of slavery. These people were still able to earn their freedom, but this is sort of closer to what people consider to be slavery. They would have been forced into that situation.
And I think that that's something that we still see now when people take passport documents or whatnot.
Yeah, and these people do not have their own freedom. The articles making the rounds are just skirting the truth by not mentioning that this is indentured servitude. The numbers and facts included range from exaggerated to outright incorrect. The claims that Irish slavery that was anything like African chattel slavery are simply wrong. This is why fact-checking sources like Snopes and the New York Times calls them out for being fake news. But people are still annoyed at this kind of censorship, as I saw articles about Facebook warning people that this claim was disputed. Although I saw articles with screenshots showing the warnings that Facebook was giving users who were sharing links to these stories, stating things like disputed by Snopes.com and the Associated Press, I was personally unable to reproduce this. I managed to post 4 articles making the claim, including that same link mentioned in an article about Facebook catching them, and was not able to elicit the same reaction. It seems like this feature hasn't been rolled out to all users, which may explain my different experience. The Irish were a kind of slave, but they weren't chattel slaves and did not experience anything like African slaves did in much greater numbers. The broad idea and specifics about this, which have been shared by many sort of racist people on social media, are simply wrong. Snopes is right. The New York Times is right. Someone is wrong on the internet.
Go figure.
As with many things in the world, there are multiple definitions of one thing, or there is a continuum of experience within that thing.
Yeah.
Always good to keep in mind. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, listeners, for joining us once again. I gave you a relatively long overview of the Implicit Association Test, and it's not quite what we hoped it would be in any way, at least for individuals.
Yeah.
And Cristina showed us, well, it's technically an infringement on the artist to take photos of the Eiffel Tower at night because of the lights. You're probably safe doing so unless you're commercially profiting from it. And Adam showed us that there were indeed Irish slaves, but they were more of the type of indentured servants than chattel slavery. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.